Good day, everyone. Welcome to today's use case. Today's use case is based on a very practical approach where a existing manufacturer had some lesser technically focused people that focused on the building management and the environmental factors purchase a wireless sensing system to put wireless sensors in all the buildings and in all the areas and collect temperature and humidity and all other related data. The challenge was that because technically they did not understand what the architectural requirements and the application requirements was, when the production people then said, well, that's great, can we please have that temperature as well as humidity information into our control system so that we can log it and alarm it and display it to the operator? They realized that, this doesn't do OPC or any other known protocol for that matter, because the wireless sensors actually spoke to a local gateway, and the only way to get information in and out of that gateway, which is cloud-based, was to use the gateway's built-in REST API and do calls against the API. So that was a little bit of a challenge, but nevertheless, to the rescue. We discussed the application in depth with the client, and we managed to find a very simplistic way using a solution from Software Toolbox called OPC Router to achieve exactly what the production people needed to integrate this sensor information back into the traditional plant control system. So we've used Router to make a call or a RESTful call against the RESTful API of the sensors. 99% of the time that RESTful API returns something in a JSON type payload. So we needed to understand and retrieve that JSON file with its payload, go through it, understand it, play with it, and then take whatever it is we wanted from there, write it to variables, and then again decide, do we want to serve it out of the OPC Router platform using the built-in OPC UA server, which is the bottom component here? Or in this case, we also sent those items or the variable values to predefined tags or items that was already in an existing OPC server on the plant. So without further ado, let me move over to my application screen and show everyone a little bit about OPC Router. So again, just a little bit of an introduction to OPC Router being this event-driven middleware that can work wonders. We have a number of things. On the left-hand side, we have what we call our plugins. So the plugins typically is what we define as where my data comes from and where my data goes to, for that matter, depending on how simple or how easy or how difficult and complex you want to actually set up your transfers. So in this case, as I mentioned, we've got both a OPC UA server, which we are serving the data out of from a OPC Router perspective. So in order to set up a server, it's very easy. Give it a name, give it a port. It kind of dynamically builds your endpoint address, decide what your security methodology you're using, and what are you actually outputting. So that's as easy as that. But also, as I mentioned, we wanted this to manipulate and change some tags on an existing OPC UA server. So in this case, we just have top server, which is also an OPC UA server, and we just provided its endpoint and security profile, etc., and we can connect Router to our OPC UA server. So we will do both in this case. And then what I mentioned is we have a RESTful API for that matter. Now, I don't have personal access to the wireless sensors, but we've used something. There's a plethora of these free APIs with limited usage available on the internet. So we literally just selected one. So I'm going to play around as if it's the wireless sensor API, but literally this is just a weather service. So we are going to, like in the real life scenario where we passed it a XY location or a building number and a height or whatever the case might be, we are just going to, when we do the API call, pass this API a latitude and a longitude, and we're going to get something back in a JSON format. So we just have the host URL. That's as easy as that. Now, When we start looking at router on the right hand side, this is where we have all our transfer objects, where we can do our ETL and our transforms and our manipulation of data, as well as connect the data sources that we've just configured on the left hand side. And then lastly, which I'll show you guys, is we then decide when we've built one of these transfer or connections, how and what triggers this connection. So without further ado, let's move to the connection that I've created. Now, this is a fairly complex connection, so I'm going to take it step by step. So the first thing, as what we mentioned, was that there's a REST call that needs to be made. Now, what I'm just going to do here quickly is I've got a little note API file because I want to show everyone a few things. So typically with a REST call, while I'm opening up the REST object here, is there's a whole bunch of things that you need to know in order to know how and what you need to give this and what you expect in return. So by literally just dragging over the REST object, as I've shown everyone a little bit earlier, we've just created the weather API service, and there's the host. Now typically that host means nothing because the host you've got to kind of append with what version, what do I pass the API, etc. is what I set. So similarly to what I've just copied out of the notepad file, it's something like that, saying, look, and there, did it without even doing that. But I just literally gave it a little bit of a connection string. And rather than said, okay, I know where to get the information from, what the actual endpoint is, and by the way, the request parameters, which is all query strings, I'll just put as variables so you can manipulate that. So here we have it. We're giving it a longitude, a latitude, what we want from an hourly perspective, what's the units we want, what's the wind speed, and probably forecast days and some models also, which doesn't make any sense at this stage. And we can quickly see it doesn't make any sense. So we can say, well, just give it the default values we've just given in terms of this this endpoint which we've just copied in. And if I run a test, it's going to come back and say, okay, here is a JSON file. Now, what I need to do is I'm going to do a Control-A, Control-C. And just to show everyone, I'm going to actually push the JSON file in there. So that is kind of the return we get. Now, I get restless when I look at that because I don't know where to start in order to start pulling that apart to just get something simple like a temperature for a specific sensor with an XY location or a latitude and a longitude. But nevertheless, we will go through that very, very, very easy. So we've shown that to you guys. The second thing we'll do, I'll delete that REST object in a second, is we obviously now have this REST that gives us this JSON. So you would see this JSON read object here. So I'm just going to go down here and say, look, bring me a blank JSON read object. Now, when I open the object from its natural state, there's nothing in there. But I've got this little magical button here that says edit. And you would see that little curly brackets that's empty. If I now paste this dummy payload that we've just received from the endpoint in there, and I click the edit button again, it'll just go through that payload and very cleverly tell us, okay, you know what? I can give you the following from this payload. So now it's as easy as saying, well, I would like that attribute, I'd like the time zone, I'd like the time, I probably want that temperature, which is just the description or the unit, and then probably I would like that temperature. And as you click on it, it just enables and adds to the attribute list. So I won't do that to mess it up. I've done that already. So you would see I've gone through that payload and I said, well, those are the values that I'm actually interested in. And then the last thing is we literally just add in a little variable object again to match variables, because I want these variables now to write to both my top server, as what we've mentioned, as well as my data access. So just to show you from a top server perspective, let me just clean this up. That was a little OPC data access object I dragged over, and I have the tag browser, and I literally just say, look, you know what, I've got right at the bottom, I've created something called use cases and top server. So I've built a fairly deep component in terms of wireless sensors for the building, and select which temperature I'm actually passing through. And there is its actual ID. So that's the top end. And the bottom end was literally just the reverse, where we said, look, we don't want to connect to an existing one. We want to be the OPC server. So literally select the OPC data access UA server that we want and just tell it, look, here's my global variables, as I call it. So in this case, I want temperature A. That's as easy as that. Now the trigger objects, just to make it clear, I've not usually, what we do in a case like this is we would say, look, temperature doesn't change every second. So in the real use case here, the client, I think, reads it every 4 hours, which is good enough for their requirement and for their reporting time. I could make this 1 second, but for now, I've just given it an absolute time because I don't want to run out of my daily API calls that I have a limit, I think 1,000 a day or something against the API that I'm using on the internet. So let's put this in productive mode quickly by literally just say, look, make it productive. Before I'm not going to trigger it, so we'll just say make it productive. And you can see a green stripe means, well, this thing is now waiting for the trigger. So it's waiting for midnight. We're not going to wait until midnight. We will manually trigger it, but you would see I've just connected again to the internal OPC server that OPC Router has from a UA perspective using an external UA client. And I've just dragged over temperature. Let's do that, but dragged over temperature A, which is the point that we're writing to from the bottom perspective. And you can see we've got no value there yet. But if I literally go here and say, okay, I would like to trigger the connection, what it's going to do is it's going to take a constant value of 32 and a constant value of 3, which resembles the latitude and the longitude. We don't know where that is in the world. It would be quite funny to see what it is in the world. And we will then pass that to the rest, do a call against the rest, take the JSON, pass the JSON, send whatever it is we need into variables, and send it out to the respective OPC servers. So let's trigger the connection. So if we pass that, a couple of seconds later, it should come back to us and it says, okay, I've given it 32 and 3. My latitude and my longitude is 33 and 3, and there's everything else that comes into that JSON component that we've kind of passed out. I've taken that values, I've mapped it to variables, and I'm just sending the temperature value to the respective OPC servers as items, and there's my value, 56.1. Now I want to take this use case just a little bit further, because in this instance, this facility didn't only have one sensor. I mean, then I would have pulled a pair of wire and just connected to the closest PLC. So Router also has an extensive way of using templates to efficiently expand a predefined template so that you can very quickly and very easily use instances of these templates to get things from REST APIs, etc., etc. So we're going to quickly try and build a template from a live perspective. So if I go back to my connection that I've created before, I can literally go and click on API to OPC. I can say create a template from this connection. So I can say, look, I want to store it in my template folder. I'll give it a name called API to OPC, and there I've got a template that's created. So when I do a template, obviously I want to steer clear from any constant values or whatever, because that defeats the purpose. So in this instance, I'm going to delete the constant values. What I am interested in is create a variable or a parameter for that. So I can, for example, say, look, I'm not passing constant values anymore. I would like to take this value and parameterize it. So in this instance, for example, I'm going to call it, what did we have, latitude. So let's start with latitude. So I'll say latitude, and the one below it I'll call longitude by literally just creating a new variable and call it longitude. There we go. So now that name or that parameter is actually resembled by a variable for that matter. So I've made that dynamic. We're not changing anything on the OPC or the JSON read object. We're not changing anything in our variables. What I am going to do, just for simplistical sake, is kind of say we're not going to write to top server. We're literally only going to serve it out using the built-in OPC UA server. But As you can see, these latitude, longitude has now appeared as variables. So when I do an instance or instantiation of this template, I can tell this thing, look, this is your latitude, your longitude, your X or Y coordinate. I also need to tell this thing, where are you writing, or which OPC item are you writing this to? So in order to achieve this, I'll take the browse path or the item, and I would say, look, I'm going to create a new variable, so we're going to call it sensor. And then I have this expression mode language where I can then say, okay, I don't want to write it to temp A because that's a fixed or a constant again. I want to send this to whatever I called that little extension called sensor, for example. So if I say apply, you would see it's going to, whatever I give it a sensor, it's going to substitute that in the instance. So we have now created a instance that theoretically will work when I instantiate it. So what I'm going to try and do is kind of say, let me create, just for testing purposes, a single instance of this. So we're going to do API to OPC. We're going to put it in our use cases. We're going to call it, we're going to go back to temp1. Or temp A as we called it, and we're going to say, look, let's give it a latitude of 54 and a longitude of 76, and we know that our value is temp A for that sensor bit to complete the OPC item name. So we shall say create. Now if I go back here, you would now see I've got a instance that comes from my template with 54, 76 and temp A, and I should see that my name is kind of expanded for my OPC item. So if I literally just have a look at that, we've got 56.1 under temp A. We've given it different longitude and latitude attributes now. So if I say, well, make the changes productive, go to temperature A and just trigger it manually, we should get something back, and that coming back now is 18.4 and not a 56.1 anymore, which resembles that. So I know the template I've created is pretty much foolproof. It works. So I can be really brave now and go say, well, I want to do multiple instances. So we still have a few left that I've pre-configured in terms of OPC item names. So I can say, look, I'll put them all in use cases, but I want B, C, D, E. So we're going to call it temp B. Just for the sake of time, let's just do a B, C, D, and E. We're going to put some really arbitrary kind of values in here. I've got no idea what it's going to, we'll pick what is the nicest temperature you would like to be in, and obviously this we know now becomes, because that's the suffix, so that completes the OPC item name. And by the way, I can also manipulate that. If it's a lot of instances, I can create it in Excel and import this from Excel. So by doing that, I've now created 4 additional instances with its own parameters that I'm passing through and its own OPC items that it's actually creating to. So we'll say create instances. I will close this. I will go back to the connections that I've created. There's B, for example, C, D, and E. So we are just going to say, look, let's make the productive change, or the changes productive. Select B, C, D, and E. And before I then go manually trigger them, because I don't want to run them on time, I'm just going to drag over B, C, D, and E. And you can see we've got no values there yet. So if I literally go back to router and say, well, trigger that one, trigger the next one, trigger the next one, trigger the next one, we should, in the external UA client, see all kinds of different temperatures. And from here, I'll probably pick the 60.5 Fahrenheit where I want to stay. So this is how we can also very simplistically expand the OPC router by the utilization of templates and serving that out as UA items. Thank you.